Hello everyone and welcome to Insights for Leaders. I'm Linda Ellett and I lead our consumer, retail and leisure practice here at KPMG, and I'm delighted to be back as our host for our 2024 series of events. Thank you to Anna Purchase for hosting our 2023 series. Today we're looking at digital growth and resilience. So let's set the scene. Ongoing economic uncertainty is knocking the confidence of consumers and also investors. At the start of this year, 41% of consumers said they feel less financially secure than they did at the start of 2023, and 58% of consumers are planning to reduce their spend on non-essential items. Venture capital investment into the UK innovators fell by 45%. Investment in UK fintechs was down 34% in 2023. So that puts a huge onus on organisations to find new ways to deliver growth and resilience, and they're turning to emerging tech to help them achieve that. They're looking at how further automation of processes can drive efficiency and reduce costs. They're investigating how generative AI can help their people deliver even better work. They're moving more and more systems and data to the cloud. But new tech brings with it new risk, whether that's the threat of a cyber attack taking down services or unethical use of AI, and that means new regulations. So the question is, how can you harness emerging tech to drive growth and differentiate your business, whilst also managing risk and staying compliant with a myriad of digital regulations? We have a great lineup of guests here to help me answer that question. I'm joined by Ioanna Lakidis, EMA Chief Compliance Officer and Global Assurance Director for Google. Ioanna will share how Google stays compliant while taking a lead on emerging tech to drive their growth. We have Paul Lloyd, co-founder and CMO of Snoop. He'll share how Snoop is using personal banking information to help consumers save money, and all whilst focusing on data privacy. And we have Michael Muller, founder and executive chair of Form3 with us. Michael will share how his business is reimagining payment technology while complying with digital and payment regulations. And from KPMG, I'm joined by Isabel Simpson, partner and solicitor in KPMG Law. Isabel is here to give us the lowdown on what we need to be up to speed with and what firms should be doing now to ensure they're compliant. Then, once we've covered digital growth and resilience, we're also going to hear from Tim Sarson, our UK Head of Tax Policy. With a budget looming, Tim will give us his predictions on what could be included and what it could mean for business. We'll leave time at the end so you can put your questions to our panel during the Q&A session. So please share your questions in the chat box on the right of your screen, and we'll be posing some questions to you too as our audience, so do keep an eye out for them. For any of you who aren't familiar with the Spot Me platform, please check the chat box for our top tips on how to get the best out of our event. As ever, it's a packed schedule, so let's get started. Ioanna, let's start with you. It's great to have you here with us today. I'd like to start off by talking about tech innovation at Google. You're very much at the heart of emerging tech, so how do you manage to innovate at pace while staying on top of new regulations and, of course, maintaining users' trust?
Thank you, Linda, and so wonderful to be here, and thank you for having me in this wonderful panel. That's a really hard question and a really big challenge, not only for Google, but for any tech company. And the ability to, or requirement to innovate at speed that we see across the board and across tech, but beyond, is necessary not only to stay relevant, but to keep our users. So first things first, at Google, user trust is at the forefront of our business. Without user trust, we don't have a business, and that's a really bad thing. And an innovation is endemic within our business, and we need to continue to do it. So the way I think about it is that it's essentially principle-based. So compliance, to me, and I'm sure Michael and Paul would say the same, is a requirement and is something that one needs to do irrespective of whether regulations there. We all know what the right thing to do is. Keeping your information private is a really good thing. We didn't need GDPR to tell us, but GDPR essentially leveled the playing field and ensured that at least there's a baseline of what everyone needs to do. So let's make sure that we have a principle-based approach and we continue to do what we need to do. Culture, especially at Google, is at the forefront of us being able to create and continue our user trust journey. So if you have the trust, if you have, the trust of the user, that works really well. So in any event, I think for Google, what we are seeing is making sure that we continue to innovate while fulfilling the required obligations. And we do that through ensuring our culture is at the forefront, ensure that we monitor our rules and regulations, and we do that endemically throughout all our processes. It's not something that we do at the end of the user journey. It's very much at the forefront.
That's really good to hear. It's very much part of the business as usual. It's not something done separately. One of the questions I want to ask you, you mentioned culture, mentioned people. How do you think about getting stakeholders in the business involved early on as you're starting to make changes?
Great question. I think it's always a cross-functional journey at Google. There's not only one single team and one single person that owns the compliance world. And definitely there's an ecosystem of people within the business that we need to work with. So we start at the very beginning. As I said, it's part of the process, and it's part of a governance world that we work and ensure that people are aligned with the principles that we've set at the very start of the journey. And then at the very end, we make sure that we monitor and we do post-mortems. We always look at, and I think that's for every organization now, failure is only a challenge that we can learn from and do better the next time. So we do that a lot.
Brilliant. No, that's helpful. I want to just go, because Google's obviously a global business and regulations aren't the same in every country. The regulators don't all agree on it. How do you manage that so that you're complying with all the different regulations in different countries whilst also being consistent with what Google is?
That is always a challenge, and I have to say I now currently have an EMEA role and a global role, and that juxtaposition between what sort of is a global regulation, if it ends up like a global regulations, but also the requirements that you have in a single market is always a challenge. And again, I go back to the principle-based approach. We do make sure that we have a oversight on all of the relevant regulations that are popping up across the board and across the world. And we have teams that, if you like, even engage at the very outset of a regulation, a policy in each of the local markets, so they understand the culture and they understand and have visibility on what's going to happen much earlier than we would if we didn't have that sort of local bedrock. And we have processes in place to make sure that any controls or any actions that we take are essentially able to result in compliance across all of the requirements that are in that space. So we don't really solve for one single compliance requirement, we solve of them all, and we always have a very high standard. So going back to my answer in the first question, to me, and definitely to Google, compliance with regulation is doing the right thing. We know what the right thing is. Never, to my understanding, has a regulation, especially in tech, been put in place that people go, oh, I wonder why we have the DSA. We do have to have some content moderation. We all know what we need to do, so let's do a really good job. And we end up doing as much as we can when we can, and are always transparent that we're doing it across all the world to the extent that we can.
Yeah, I love that idea that actually this is just helping us go in the direction we should be. And again, a theme of collaboration coming out there, which perhaps leads me on to the next question. So Google also owns other tech brands like Fitbit, YouTube. How much do you kind of work together and look at the same compliance strategies with those sister brands?
Great sister brands. I think that in some cases very separate corporations. So some people call it consistency, like we have to have consistency across the board. I look at it as a sort of form of alignment. Going back to the point of principles, if you have a very clear view of principles and culture across the whole of alphabet, which we generally try and embody, then all you need to do, it's a very hard problem to solve. If I'd solved it, I would really be on a beach in the Maldives right now, and I'm not. But you need an alignment at the very least, and an understanding as to the requirements for each of these corporate structures, or we call them product areas or businesses, so that you are essentially fulfilling the requirements that you need to, but allowing them to grow and innovate in their specific spaces. Why? Fitbit has a totally different requirement when it comes to compliance than YouTube. Why? Fitbit is all about hardware, potentially health data. YouTube is about content. Does not mean that you have to have separate compliance requirements, obligations, but you're going to have a different flavor. So to me, it's the understanding that we need to alignment, definitely a level of consistency when it comes to how we show up in a country, for example. So if you look at YouTube is a separate brand, but it's owned by Google. It would be really, really awful if anything that YouTube was doing seemed to be in contrast with something that Play in our world was doing. So we do make sure that we've got governance structures to make sure that what you're doing on one side of the fence is the same on this side of the fence. A challenge, because in terms of the scale and speed, and I know we're going to talk about AI, and we should, it is really, really hard to do at the scale and speed when you've got so many different things happening at the same time. So yeah, it's a hard one to do, but we definitely try.
Well, just pick up that thread a little bit then on the AI piece, and how is that helping you with some of that scale and speed?
Well, I think it's one of those things, AI, and it's my favorite topic, I have to say, and I could talk forever, but I know that we've got other people here. And generative AI also. I think it's helping a ton. And I think there's so much opportunity out there, both for us to use it in our day-to-day job, as well as sort of us to, from a business perspective, to make sure that others are able to use it effectively, and even gain and hopefully retain user trust. I think it's moving at such speed that we're all sort of trying to figure out what we can and cannot use and should use and could use and what helps. At Google, we have wonderful tools that literally pop up, and I'm not exaggerating for a fact, on a daily basis. Oh, there's this tool and this tool and this tool. I'm still stuck on tool sort of 3 weeks ago, trying to figure out how I can use it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us and a lot of knowledge that we all need to gain, and a lot of sort of excitement, but I think there's also a lot of homework that we need to do. And I mean, definitely for me, is we seem to not have the time to do the homework of all the stuff that we have that we can use. So and just as an example, in my team right now, I have literally somebody whose current 20% project is, can you please tell me all of the tools that we have available within Google that I can use today, and I can make all my team efficient. And that's only me. I'm sure everyone is doing the same, so I think it's going to catch up. But there's definitely a lot that we can do on sort of making manual processes more automated, to actually helping us content creation, of helping us brainstorm how we do things. So there's definitely a lot to do and a lot to learn.
I think that's probably a great tip for a lot of the leaders in our audience as well, is actually asking somebody to set out all the tools that you have available to make you more efficient. So we're definitely taking that away. Thank you, Joanna. That's super interesting and great way to get started. Before we go to our next guest, we do have a question for you, our audience. So our question for you is, in your experience, do regulations hinder or enable digital innovation at your business? So choose either regulations hinder innovation or regulations enable innovation. And we'll take a look at your answers later. So Paul, let me bring you in now. Paul, for our audience members who may not be as familiar with Snoop, could you just start by giving us some background on what Snoop does and also how you built the company?
Sure. So Snoop's a mobile app. We think of it as a guardian angel that lives on your phone that helps you to make better financial decisions. That's the vision of the business we've been building. So the way that it works is, when you download and start to use the Snoop app, you can use open banking technology to actually connect your current account and your credit cards to Snoop. That data then flows through to our platform, and what we use it to do is to help you manage your money better and to make better decisions. So Snoop will allow you to see all of your bank accounts in one app. You don't need to use, our average user connects 3 banks to Snoop, so you don't need to use 3 apps to try and manage your money. We will spot if you don't have enough money to pay your bills for the month and tell you well ahead of time. We'll help you create a budget, typically something that's been really hard for consumers to do. But we know, and we can see the money that's coming into your account and the bills and money that flows out, so we can create a budget for consumers in 2 taps. And we do things like use the data to spot where consumers spend and then make sure they're accessing loyalty schemes, for example, that are available. So you can use the data kind of for huge consumer good to help people manage their money better and to try and just improve the way really that everyone deals with money. So that's the purpose of the business and the journey we've been on as we've grown the product.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. I know with my consumer hat on how tough it is for consumers out there trying to balance balance the books and still trying to find some money for some little treats. So it's great to hear how Snoop helps with that. And I've followed the Snoop journey for quite some time. So, it's great to hear how it's developing and progressing. Paul, I'm interested to hear just about the role compliance has played in your growth story, and I guess if there's been tension between looking to innovate at speed for consumers and at the same time staying compliant in what is, a very highly regulated area. When we've spoken before, you said it's not about working around the regulations, engaging with the regulator instead. And actually there was a particular story you shared with me about re-authentication and how the regulations there have evolved to deliver a better customer experience. Could you kind of just talk about that topic and share that story as well, please?
Sure. So, regulation for us is at the very heart of Snoop. So Snoop came about because of open banking, the open banking regulation, the open banking, which was mandated. It came from the Competition and Markets Authority. They wanted open banking to kind of foster and encourage innovation and kind of competitiveness in UK financial services and beyond. And so that was really the start point for our business. It was how could we use this regulation, this opportunity really that regulation brings to deliver better outcomes to consumers. So it was really the spark for our business. And I think I completely agree with you, Anna, around, regulation is designed to deliver good outcomes for consumers, particularly in, the financial world. It's principle-based and outcome-based. And so actually I don't see a tension between the product you're trying to build and complying with regulation and deliver great outcomes for consumers. Actually, everything's pointing in the same direction. And so really for us, it's played a huge part in our growth around, it was the start point for our business. And I think that, the story around re-authentication, I think, my experience has been that where some things, so just to give it a little bit more context, in open banking, there's a really good discipline, which is that consumers every 90 days have to reconsent for their data to continue to be shared. It's completely the right thing to do, to go back to the point. Because what one wouldn't want is consumers to sign up to a product, forget about it, and their data to flow forever. So the 90-day rule is really important. When the regulation was first introduced, it actually required the consumer to go to each individual bank and say, I'm still happy for that data to be shared. Now that's a barrier for the consumer, and ultimately actually not a terribly sensible one. What's much more appropriate is for that that consent to be given to i.e. us, the data is flowing to. And so what we've seen over the past 12 months is the Financial Conduct Authority has actually changed that. It now allows the provider to collect the consent from the consumer, to share that with the banks, so the banks continue to share the information. And what that's meant is a much better experience for users, a much better experience for businesses like ours. And actually, the whole direction of travel is a positive one around that. But really importantly, it still requires every 90 days for the customer to reconsent, and that's a great outcome. So I think, for us, there's no tension between the need to comply and to be kind of compliance friendly and delivering the right thing for the consumer. And so we don't really see that tension. It's a very natural thing, I think, in our business.
And it's a really nice example of where there potentially could have been some tension, but actually there's an ability to see those regulations changed because everybody is still trying to serve the customer.
Yeah, everyone's trying to get the right outcome.
So,
absolutely.
Just sticking with that kind of customer theme, I know you're very customer centric at Snoop. You've also got lots of kind of digital tech people, when you're looking to innovate fast, how do you keep that customer centricity at the heart of it as the digital and tech guys kind of disappear off to do the funky things? Just to tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a great challenge. I think there's a sort of, we do it in two ways really. One is a big picture way, which is to be really clear about what's the vision of the business we're building, who is it for, what's it there to do, and to keep that, really clear purpose, keep that in mind so everyone understands that. We talk about it a lot. We get together every day for 15 minutes and talk about our progress and what we're doing. But the other thing we do, which I think started, I've never seen it in a business outside of Snoop, is that we share all of our customer feedback in real time all the time. So there's a Slack channel that we use that literally, as feedback comes in, it could be an App Store review, it could be a piece of consumer feedback that's come into our team, it pops up, whether it's good or whether it's bad. And so if you're an engineer or you're a QA analyst or you're a marketeer working on a new communication, actually you will see what customers say about your product. And when they love your product, it feels amazing. And when actually they feedback on your product that there's something you might have missed or it can be done better, actually it kind of propels people to want to take that on board and to learn. And so that constant flow of feedback has been incredibly powerful for us. And I think it sort of brings us together. You know, we're one team trying to deliver a great outcome for consumers, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. But actually, that flow of information kind of continually focuses the mind, and I think it just keeps everyone very kind of on script about what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I love that. And as a consumer, when you take the time to actually feedback, to know that that's going straight into the business, that's brilliant to hear. Right, we have got our first poll results in, so panel, you can have a look. I'm just going to ask each of you very quickly just for a reaction to that. So we can see that our audience has thoroughly sat on the fence. 52% of you think it hinders innovation and 48% of you think it enables innovation. Paul, maybe just start with you. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's almost 50-50.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to see it split by industry. I think that would be a fascinating...
That's a great idea. We will see if we can do that.
A fascinating
Brilliant.
outcome, so
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Thank you,
I was
Anna.
literally going to say the same, but then I thought also it's actually quite surprising that it's not even more on the hindering innovation. So I think that's a really positive outcome, in that the idea that actually regulation is sort of not as negative in its way than it could be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael.
Well, we're active in payments, and I think we've seen a shift in that area. So banks have always seen it as a bit of a hindrance. But with all the innovation that is coming into payments, I think there's now great recognition that this needs to go hand in hand with regulation, with the regulators, with the Bank of England, and whoever is regulating that business. So I'm more on the helping.
On the positive as well. We've obviously got the right panel here. You're all very positive. We'll do the poll again at the end. I'm also smiling because our team wouldn't let our audience have a I'm not sure answer. So 52-48 is as close to I'm not sure as we could have got. But Michael, let's stay with you now. So Michael, Form3 provides a platform that processes payments, as you referenced there, for regulated financial service providers. Could you explain for our audience what that means and quite how it works?
Sure. So different from Snoop, I don't think consumers have ever heard of us or have seen us in the business, because we're very much operating behind the scenes. So we're basically the technology that is running for banks that picks up a payment after you've initiated it on whatever device you've used. So we're sitting behind the apps, we're sitting behind the electronic banking systems, and we're really connecting the banks to the central infrastructure that is used for sending the payment to the other bank or the destination. So we are a London-based tech company. We're working with many of the biggest banks in the UK, in Europe, and in the US. And we're processing an awful lot of payments.
Brilliant, thank you. No, that's really good to get an understanding. One of those things behind the scenes that none of us know about, but is so critical every day. And interestingly, again, when we spoke, so your payments platform is based in the public cloud. Now, public cloud used to be something that we thought of as reserved for software development rather than something as critical, critical system like payments. So can you just share with our audience why public cloud and how do you ensure security and resilience with it?
So Form3 was born in 2016, and that was probably about the time when the public cloud became mature enough for hosting mission-critical architecture. I think a lot of the challenger banks came up in that time frame. FinTech in general pushed into the public cloud, and that's indeed where we started off. The advantages are quite clear. I mean, I don't need to explain that to my colleague here. So we're working with Google, we're working with Amazon, and we're also working with Microsoft. I think whether it's the public cloud or the private cloud, and in fact we're actually running both, the important thing is, and I think that the jump on the technology side here is really component-based architecture. It is the tooling that you can get off the shelf, the open source, everything that is built around cloud-native technology that we've been able to use from day one, and many of our customers haven't had, in their operations because those are, these estates are 10, 15, 20 years old. So what we represent, I think, in the payments world is a technology shift from on-prem, server-based, heavy data center-based technology to cloud-native architecture. Now, we've taken that concept a step further, and I think we're one of the very few companies who are actually running a multi-cloud setup. So we run active across different public clouds, which means we can fail over from one cloud to the other in real time. And that means we're increasing the resilience of the infrastructure for the banks and ultimately for the consumers, so that these systems are always available.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. That makes sense. And again, just showing technology is moving so quickly, but the speed you've got to move. Now, as you said at the start, your payments platform isn't something that consumers are going to see, but they are going to feel it if something does go down. And I understand that's why there's a strong possibility that your business could become directly regulated as what's called a critical service provider. What would that actually mean for you, for your business and for your customers if you were categorized like that?
Yeah, payments are an interesting product in a way. You never really think about it until it doesn't work. And then it becomes really annoying, right? So nobody wakes up in the morning and thinks I really want to make a payment. So it's in that camp. So we're clearly in the infrastructure space, but that also means that availability, resilience, data security, all of that is extremely important. The other thing about payments is that it is an area that is moving at a very rapid speed. So there is obviously real-time payments are coming in many countries in the world. We've had them here in the UK for many years, but they're landing in Europe, they're landing in the US, and they're ramping up massively in places like Brazil or India. And that's really the ability to transfer transfer money in real time to the beneficiary. Crypto is, playing a role, and is much talked about, but it's again advances in technology. The flip side of that is you have issues like authorized push payment fraud. And so if you transfer money in real time, the money is gone. And if you didn't want to make that payment or didn't want to make that payment to that account, the money is gone. So you need to build in protection to ensure that you keep the consumer safe. And then obviously there's a cyber risk is becoming more important. Geopolitical considerations are coming in, where I think countries are more interested in keeping their payment infrastructure safe. Touched on AI. It's an important topic. It reaches the payments world in the same way it reaches many other businesses in terms of phishing has become a lot easier. So, cyber attacks are becoming more efficient, not necessarily more intelligent, but more efficient. Deep fakes, all of this, we've seen some of it, where, somebody's faked me with my German accent, right? And, it was actually not too bad, annoyingly. So, all of that leads to a situation where I think the regulator, and in our case, that's mainly the Bank of England, or the relevant European authorities, they do take a look at that as well, and they have realized that regulation is required. More regulation is required to not only capture the primary providers of these services, so the banks, but also critical suppliers to the banks, and that includes the cloud providers, and may include other infrastructure providers. And yes, we might be called by that. For me, that's a good thing. And I've always believed that if regulation is designed and applied in an intelligent way, it will foster innovation. We can see that very clearly. I mean, the whole crypto industry is crying out for more regulation, because that's the only way for them to provide these services safely. Payments are quite similar. So we're not sort of fighting it. We see it as potentially an efficient way for managing risk.
Yeah, excellent. No, and almost takes us right back to where Joanna started us with. If you're doing the right thing, the regulation comes in to put the wrap around that. So that's really positive to hear, although I am more nervous about my payments now. So thanks, Michael. Right, we're going to come to our audience again for another poll question. Let's see if we can be more decisive as an audience this time. So our question for you is, as a business, have you identified the specific compliance and reputational risks posed by your use of AI? So yes, you have, no, you haven't, or actually you don't know yet whether the business has looked at that. So please answer our poll and we'll take a look at your responses later. But first though, let's bring in Isabel. Isabel, so many regulations in place. We've heard some of them referenced and more on the way that are all going to impact digital growth. And not all of them are directed at specific tech. So for our audience, which regulations do they need to be on top of? And maybe any that you think they might not have considered yet?
Thanks, Linda, and thanks for having me here today. It's a really interesting area, and I think the reason why we're seeing a fragmented approach globally on this is because legislators are really looking at what is new about this technology that we need new regulation for. Obviously, regulation law is meant to be tech agnostic. So do you need a specific AI regulation, or can you actually use the current infrastructure of laws to mitigate those risks? I think also picking up on the poll results, it's really interesting because with new technology, there have come new risks. And if you don't have the legislation in place to address those risks, then actually you can't innovate in that space, because you'll be innovating in a way potentially that is unsafe, or that isn't trustworthy, or that isn't resilient. So that's what these new regulations are looking at. So if we take the UK approach, what the UK government is looking at is they're looking at white papers, they're producing guidance, they produced a very helpful AI assurance framework, but they've said at this point they don't think they need a new regulation in this space. So they've also called on the regulators to provide guidance from their perspectives on AI. So for UK companies, what do they need to do? They need to consider the current law and how they bring that together when they're considering AI or new innovation, and that's things like copyright law, data protection law, contractual liability. They need to consider consumer protection, human rights. There's a huge amount of law that is already there, actually, that is regulating in this space. From an EU perspective, though, if we've got UK organisations that are in the EU, then they need to look at the European approach, which is new regulation. It's underpinned by data protection regulation, but we have new regulation specifically for AI, and also we have the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. There's a huge amount, and they need to take a really holistic approach to looking at that. But they also shouldn't forget that beneath all of that as well, within Europe, there are all of those other rules already in place around intellectual property rights and so on. So they really have to take a holistic approach to understanding those rules, and there are a lot, as Joanna mentioned.
Brilliant. I think I was trying to count those on my fingers, Isabel, and I was in danger of having to take my shoes off at that point. But yeah, so lots to think through on that. Now, when we've talked before, you've talked about kind of the 3 myths of digital regulation. Can you share with the audience those myths that you talk about?
Yeah, so one, I think, is we need a new control framework to address these new regulations. Actually, organisations should have in place a process for ingesting new regulation, and a control framework that just really needs to be uplifted to take account of that kind of net new risk that we're looking to address. If we take another myth is that we have to wait for regulation. Again, picking up on one of Joanna's points about doing the right thing, if we look at the new regulations in the area of online safety, for example, organisations who enable digital content have been looking at how they keep the vulnerable children safe. They will already have, or should have from an ethical perspective, protections and guardrails in place. Hopefully what the new regulation in this area will do is it will ensure that organisations are taking a consistent approach and that regulators are really able to monitor what they're doing. But it shouldn't be something that they haven't been looking at. I think the third one is, well, let's wait for the regulation to come into force before we do anything about it. And there's a number of risks there, of course. One is that you're not making the space safe for children, for the vulnerable, if we look at online safety. And I think the other difficulty is that if you are innovating and you're not taking into account the new regulation, you may well not be able to use what you have created once that regulation is in place. So I don't think there is an excuse to not be doing something now.
No, that's really helpful. There's a really strong theme actually from all of you, but it's about doing these things in parallel, collaborating, moving everything forward. But I suppose, Isabel, so if I'm one of our audience and I'm thinking, somebody's going to come and ask me a question about whether my controls are compliant, what's the approach I should take? What could I be doing now to feel confident about answering that question?
So I think there are a number of things that can be done. I think what's really important is this concept of accountability and evidence. So wherever you are on your compliance journey, make sure that it's documented, make sure that you can produce the evidence. The other thing I think is very important is understand the approach that the regulators are going to take. Regulators, legislators globally are bringing in regulation proportionally to their own society. They are looking at their own society and they are bringing in rules that they think will suit that. And regulators are enforcing also in different ways. So I think you need to understand the expectation of the regulators as well. Thirdly, I think you need to have a really consistent approach and really think about how do you engage with regulators. Are you very defensive or are you collegiate? Are you putting your best foot forward? One of the panels actually that I heard yesterday, one of the regulators was saying, please be polite when you are liaising with us. So that's obviously very important. So it's building that positive evidential trail and having a positive approach and a cultural approach to compliance as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Isabel. Well, so now it's time for us to look at the results of our second poll. We asked you whether, as a business, have you identified the specific compliance and reputational risks posed by your use of AI? So we can see we've got a third of you are comfortable that you have identified the compliance and reputational risks. 37% are saying they haven't, and 30% saying they don't know whether their organisation has. I guess maybe, Isabel, just a first question to you on those results, because a lot of our audience won't be in compliance roles, legal roles. So are you kind of surprised that people haven't or don't know if they have, or would you think that as any leader it's worth leaning into this one?
I think it's quite telling. Unfortunately, I think it really has to be from the top level, and you need to understand from a compliance perspective across the whole organisation, what is your risk appetite, and then how are you mitigating that. So, and if you don't know what the risks are, obviously, then that's quite telling that there is an educational piece, I think, that's needed.
Okay, so it's great that people are on our session today, because this is them getting started on that journey. But I guess any reflections for any of our panel? Joanna?
I wonder whether it depends also on the maturity of the organisation, because if you're a relatively mature organisation from a risk and compliance perspective, you do have a risk assessment in place. If you are, if the Digital Services Act is in any way relevant to you, you are doing a systemic risk assessment, and you did it last year, or you will be doing it. And I think AI, as Isabel said, is just another lens. It's not a separate world of risks. So I wonder whether the answer to the question that's, again, fascinatingly split three ways now,
yes.
Which is really, really interesting, is it depends on sort of is that company or is the entity doing a risk assessment and they haven't looked at AI? Have they never done a risk assessment and therefore AI is different? I think it's really interesting to, so I go back to Paul's point. I'd love to see the industry break.
Just you're all giving us some analytics to do afterwards with the audience results. I'm looking forward to it. Michael, your thoughts on those results?
Well, I think AI is an area that is developing rapidly. I think, so even though there's a clue in the question, by your use of AI, I don't think many companies are actually using AI in anger today. So I think many companies that I talk to are working on proof of concepts. They're giving access to AI to a relatively small part of the population because they are still concerned about data loss prevention and similar topics. So I think the majority of the companies that we're talking to, and certainly in financial services, are evaluating the positives and the negatives. And I think they're coming quickly to the conclusion that the positives outweigh the negatives. So, but I think there's also recognition that you will probably have to sacrifice some of the productivity gains and the good parts of that new technology by putting specific measures in place to basically prevent the negative side effects. And I think that's kind of the same with all of those technology steps that we've seen in the past, whatever, 20, 30 years, right? So you always have to see both. And I think with AI, we're probably still very much at the beginning of that journey.
Yeah. I think, and that, that really kind of resonates in terms of our conversations with clients. There's two things. One is, yes, people are starting to look at AI, but you can't just leap straight to it. You've got to sort of prepare the ground for it, which includes what you're talking about. But the other thing people always ask us is, what should we not be doing with AI, as well as what should we be doing?
Yes.
And I think, to your point, most organisations are starting to get into it, but not leap too fast.
I think most know that it's probably a topic too important for just ignoring it.
Yes.
And, but you also don't necessarily always need to be the first mover.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little bit of that going on.
Can I make one more comment about AI? Because I think sometimes we forget that AI is not new. Like, AI has been around for years. In some cases, just now it has a name, and Gen AI has a name. So I do think sometimes we're all a bit like, it's all this new thing. All that's happening is a supercharged turbo speed of sort of products and features and data and models coming our way, and us trying to figure out what's what. And I sometimes feel, especially working at Google, I'm like, is it just a new name for something else, or is it something different? So I do want to link up back to what Isabel said, which I thought was so interesting. Because when you talk about new stuff, it's always really stuff, and by that I mean regulations, directives, anything, not anything different. It's really important to, and I couldn't agree more with your myths, and I couldn't agree more with the control framework. You need to look at what are you doing now that you can leverage, and let's not forget that controls are just a statement of what you are doing, so it shouldn't be that complicated. And what are you missing in that gap that you're having? So I would encourage the audience and all of us to take a step back and go, actually, what is new? And by that I mean net new, as opposed to new. And what do I already have that can mitigate the risk of that net new, and what do I need to build? And I think we'd all be surprised by, actually, there's a lot of stuff that I'm doing that I need to do better, and I can automate, because I knew that was a problem, and now it's even more of a problem because of this net new. And then focus on building for the net new, as opposed to sort of feeling that this is too big a problem to solve.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice for people, actually, and helps them not be overwhelmed by it as well. I think, actually, that you've probably got a lot of the building blocks there 100%. Already. Paul, just before we move on, your thoughts. I mean, obviously everything's sort of about the customer. What's your reaction to people's kind of thinking on AI and compliance so far?
Yeah, I was interested in the feedback. I mean, there's sort of 37% who haven't understood that yet. Sort of, I think it's, you just have to lean into it and solve that quite quickly.
There we go. Everyone's got some homework from this webinar. So we are going to come to some audience questions in due course, so please do keep putting them into the panel. But we have one more guest before we go to Q&A. Tim, you've been sitting there very patiently for us. Thank you very much. Tim's learnt a lot and got homework as well, but no, thank you for sitting so patiently. So we are going to move sort of a little bit off topic for a moment, because next week we have what could be the last budget before a general election. So Tim, what should we expect?
What should we expect? I think we should expect a bit of a weird budget. You mentioned this is the last one before an election, and historically, if you look at the stats, usually the last budget before the election involves some fiscal loosening, and it usually involves tax cuts. Then the first budget after an election, and that's even if the incumbents are re-elected, usually involves some tax rises and some fiscal tightening, and we would expect a bit of that. But it's difficult. It's really difficult for Jeremy Hunt because of the timing of what they're so sort of beholden to the OBR forecast these days. They're showing headroom shrinking. So you remember the last fiscal event, the autumn statement, came just at the right time, because fiscal headroom in the OBR forecast was looking quite good. It meant that Hunt could announce, for example, that the NI changes could afford to make full expensing permanent. That was the other sort of big flagship last year. That's going to be really difficult. He's going to be scrabbling around. Now, if I think about what are we likely to see, there will still be quite a lot of action in this budget, because there has to be, because it's the last one before an election. But I don't think it's going to be a particularly active one for corporate taxation. So for the sort of taxation that affects larger incorporated businesses. So the main reason for that is because there's been a lot done over the last couple of years already. We've had this journey through particularly on capital expenditure through super deductions, then to full expensing, and that being made permanent. We've had an ongoing reform of the R&D credits regime, which is now pretty much done and dusted. We've had the corporate tax headline rate yo-yoing up and down. That was a big feature of the quasi-Kwarteng budget, of course, and what happened after that. I think that's staying stable now. It's one of those things I think that Hunt would have quite liked to have got back down again, but he hasn't really got the money to do it. So I'm expecting small change on the corporate tax front. I may be completely wrong, because I'm usually surprised by one or two announcements in every budget. Where we will see changes, almost certainly, and this is not based on any great insight I'm getting or insider information. It's based on me keeping an eye on what the media are saying, because frankly I'm not on those WhatsApp groups that journalists are on where they hear what the backbenchers are telling them or they hear what was discussed in cabinet. There'll be a couple of things. The first is they are almost certainly looking to make some sort of rate cut to personal taxation, probably in national insurance rather than income tax. Two reasons for that. Firstly, because that's seen as unwinding some distortions in the way that we tax. National insurance, of course, is only taxed on people of working age, and it's not taxed on pensions and pensioners. And given that we have the triple lock being guaranteed, this is seen as a sort of a fairness thing. It also makes it a bit cheaper. We may see a couple of surprises or a couple of tweaks to thresholds, so possibly an unfreezing or a partial unfreezing of the freeze of rate thresholds that we've had for a while. But that is quite expensive. It looks like they're not going to deal with a couple of those things that really ought to be dealt with, like the tapering of child benefits, so the child benefit charge that gives you very high tax rates at around £50,000, or the tapering of the personal allowance that gives you very high tax rates at £100,000. I think we might see a slight increase in the VAT registration threshold. There's been another thing, a bit of a bugbear recently. And then we might see a couple of interesting little sneaky bits of tax raising in order to pay for those cuts. One of the questions I was getting from panel members before we got on here is, well, what's all this about the non-doms, and are they going to do that? And that's a Labour. Well, Labour has a policy to reform the non-dom regime, really sort of ancient regime based on case law. It's never been a sort of a regime as such. It just happened. There's talk of Hunt completely doing away with non-dom status. I'm sceptical, but it's come from somewhere. And the reason it's there is because that just gives him a few extra pence that he can then use to spend on pre-election tax cuts. So we'll see. But I think that's what I'm expecting at the moment, and no doubt. And you're getting a scoop on this because I'm off to be interviewed by the BBC straight after, where they're going to ask me exactly the same questions, and I'll see if anything comes up in this conversation to change my mind.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. Glad to see that we've got the scoop ahead of the BBC. Just to bring us back onto topic around kind of digital growth, innovation and regulation, not what do you think the government might do next week, but what do you think the government could do to help stimulate growth in the digital area?
Yeah, I'm going to slightly answer a slightly different question to start with, just because it's really topical, because this morning I was at HMRC have an annual stakeholder conference where they talk about what they're doing over the next 12 months, what their big priorities are. And what was really interesting was it was all about digitalisation of the tax system, self-service, the HMRC app, the use of customer data essentially in order to improve the... but essentially what's driving all of that is cost cutting, because they're feeling the squeeze. They get austerity just like every other department does. So it's a matter of necessity, and that being hopefully the mother of invention. But after years of going really slowly on making tax digital to the extent that it's almost seemed a bit of a joke, they are now really starting to get their act together. They've got 136 million, I think they've just been given specifically to spend on accelerating their digital progress. So a lot of the issues you were talking about in terms of regulation, I think it's really important. Who regulates HMRC? Who regulates the government? Because we have this same trade-off you were talking about between, if you made managing your tax affairs and your other sort of government interactions as slick as possible, that would probably involve you giving away way more and linking your data into way more government databases than you would really like. It starts to feel a bit big brothery, so they can't go quite as far as maybe from a pure consumer perspective it might be quite nice for them to do because of the risks inherent to it. So a slight sidebar, but it's interesting, government and including the tax collection systems doing the same sort of thing. I think in terms of innovation and what the government can do to support this through the tax system, digital is not a separate thing. Automation is not a separate thing from the rest of the economy. It's just embedded in everything we do. You're not going to get specific tax credits for AI investment, for example. We already have the R&D tax credit system. We have relief for capital expenditure, etc. I think what you might well see, though, particularly as AI and the growth of AI means yet more need for more data centres, for more massive energy use to support this sort of digitised economy, is maybe a bit more of a focus that we don't have at the moment in the system towards the use of green energy and towards energy efficiency, because our tax system doesn't really differentiate between green and non-green technology at the moment.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. No, that's really helpful. So we are going to go to some of our audience questions. I'm going to ask my panel to be fairly brief in their answers because I want to get through quite a few questions if we can in our last few minutes. Isabel, we've just got one very quick question from the audience. So they're a UK-only business. Do they need to worry about the EU regulations you were mentioning?
There is a lot in EU regulation that can potentially bring UK organisations on shore. I would say they need to keep an eye on what's happening in the EU, because often other countries around the world will follow what the EU is doing, as they did with data protection rules, and also really closely consider if they're ever thinking of expanding into the EU, then they would need to be compliant. So I would say they would need to stay aware of what's happening in the development.
So don't need to comply, but it's a good way of looking forward, and then obviously as part of any future strategy it's important. Thank you. So we've got a question here, actually this one's for you, Paul, very clearly references Snoop. How do you make sure that personal data is being not just kept safe but also used in the right way?
Yeah, so I think in terms of is the data safe, so actually the team that created Snoop, many of us worked at Virgin Money for a long time before, so actually the CTO of the business built a digital bank at Virgin Money. So actually we apply all the disciplines that, in fact, really over-invested in building the technology to make sure that it was bank safe, because that's the nature of the data we're working with. So there's a very, kind of large degree of technical infrastructure that delivers that safety. I think in terms of being used properly, that really then for me is about culture. It's about the business we're building, what are we there to do, making sure everyone understands that. And really importantly, actually, our privacy policy. So being really transparent with consumers, and I would say this, but I think it's a cracking good read. So we aim to make it very, very clear and transparent. And again, not a legal document, it's a consumer document. It tells them exactly how their data will be used. So they can have the confidence that we're doing it properly.
Brilliant. So yeah, they can actually understand it when they tick that terms and conditions. Very
Absolutely.
Important. So brilliant. Thank you. Question here, Joanna, I might send this one your way, which is just, with all this growth of digital, just what's happening, not just from Google, but you see more broadly about protecting users from scams online? Obviously, it's a very general question, but share some of what you see.
I see a lot of, so scams is a hard one, because the minute you've sort of figured out how to protect against one scam, they've just thought of another one. So I think what I'm seeing is a constant focus on that with cybersecurity and rules to help and make sure that data is protected, that you're securing your devices, that you're securing and making sure that it's only you that can access that data. But as I say, it's only one part of the question. So a lot has been done. I think there's a focus on high-level principles and on understanding and knowledge sharing. And I'm going to also link to Paul's answer about policies. I think there's a part of the scam situation is making sure that the person who is the victim of the scam has got understanding and knowledge. So I think there's a lot that's been done on making policies and procedures and controls much more digestible, so people know and sort of question and do not actually take action when it comes to these situations. So a lot to be done, but more to be done.
Yes, definitely. And as you say, as the technology evolves to help protect us, actually it's being used by the scammers to stay ahead. So can never sit back and relax on that one. So yeah, thank you. We've got a question actually about the impact on the environment environment of kind of all the technology infrastructure? I know, Michael, as we talked about public cloud, whether that's a question you're happy to give a view on, just how do we keep thinking about the environment as our technology starts to use higher and higher energy consumption?
Well, it's important, right? And I think it's also true that a lot of the innovation that we're seeing is consuming a lot of energy, and whether it's generative AI, whether it's Bitcoin, or similar things. Now that's one side of it. I think there's also another side of it, and that's, for instance, we're providing the services that we provide on the platform, which basically means that the individual banks that we're working with don't need to maintain individual infrastructure in each of their data centers. So, and we know that that is more efficient. We are working with, in particular, the cloud providers on green energy solutions, and I think they're putting a lot of effort into making sure that renewable energy is used in data centers. But I'm not going to brush this aside. A lot of what we're seeing in terms of tech innovation is related to heavy use of energy, and I think that's where green technologies and all this comes in and needs to, I think, go further.
Yeah.
But just to add, which is interesting maybe for our audience, is that sort of ESG regulation is something that we've been hearing a lot in the last few years as well. And one of the big premises of it is transparency. So the more that we're transparent about the usage of energy, the more that people are aware of it, and we sort of equip users and consumers with the data that they've got. So I think especially businesses that are listening to this, there should be an expectation of the requirement to be more transparent with all of the data that we use and we do. So I think something for people to think about when it comes to the environment side of things.
And I'm biased, I lead our consumer sector, but I think if consumers can be such a powerful force for good in this way, as long as they know what's happening. So yeah. I've got a question here, Isabel, I think this is going to be one for you. Should regulators and legislators apply the precautionary principle to generative AI? Maybe you can tell us what the precautionary principle is and then whether you think they should apply it.
Yeah, with generative AI, there's just a huge amount of excitement in this area. When it comes to precautionary principle, it's really, should we be stopping before and regulating before actually we allow it to go forward? And I think innovators would be, they would obviously then think that they would be very, very hindered from being able to move forward. So yeah, it's one that organisation that legislators are struggling with, but we will see how it develops. I think it's unlikely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, audience, for all your questions. Panel, don't quite sit back and relax yet, because I've got one more question for you. I can see them all breathing like this. It's been a really great discussion today, actually, and just, I guess, in terms of my big takeaways. So, digital innovation and regulation aren't at loggerheads with each other. They actually have a symbiotic relationship. We've heard that from our panel and our audience. Half of you agreed. But that we do need regulations to keep pace with the emerging tech, to make sure they don't hold us back. And they also need to be written with the business goals in mind and potentially adapted, as Paul talked about earlier. Don't hang around and wait for regulations. Make sure you're innovating in an ethical way. Ask yourself, what would my customers and regulators expect? And then, as Joanna talked right at the beginning, is the regulations can then come around that. Now, you could obviously face a hefty fine from regulators if you take a misstep, but don't just think of them as police officers. Look out for the guidance, get involved with consultation papers, and really encourage you to be part of the conversation. Before we end, it's not just Budget Day next week, we've also got International Women's Day. So I have got one final question for each of my client guests here. So just in one or two sentences, and I know you'll be doing lots, but one or two sentences, what are you doing at your organisations to really improve the representation of women in technology? Paul, can I come to you first?
Of course, yeah. So it's a very important part of our culture, actually. Our founder was the architect, Jen Angardi was the architect of the Women in Finance Charter. So it's been important since our inception, and I think for us it's all about celebrating role models, making sure we've got the right tech, the right working practices, and continually focusing on it as an area. About half of our team a management team are women, but the job never finishes, so it's really in that area that we
brilliant, just that continued focus. Yeah, I really like that. Jana?
A lot to be done. Focus on inclusion and belonging. I think that's one of making the experience of females just as good, if not better, in the tech world. I think we should all focus on that, and then of course making sure that we hire the right talent. But a lot of the experience that we offer women in our company is super important.
Brilliant. I love that word inclusion as well. I think it's so important to get
And
the
it's
right
International
context.
Women's Day next week. Do not forget
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Not that you would.
And Michael?
Well, we are passionate about bringing women into the technology sector. You know, if I look at the two parts of our business, you know, the engineering side, which is more than half of our staff, and the non-engineering side, we're doing quite well on the non-engineering side. Engineering is a lot harder.
Yeah.
And, you know, we just have to acknowledge that, and we can't change that overnight. So we think it's really important that we start early and bring girls into technology, you know, the whole STEM topic. So we're working with non-for-profit organizations, and, you know, do a lot of teaching and you know, all of that. It will take time, but you know, unfortunately, it is still the case that the pool of female software engineers is relatively small, and that makes it hard for us to get to parity in that part of the business, but we're making progress.
An absolutely relentless focus, I think, is what I hear. So that's it for today. Please do visit the resources tab for all our latest insights and events. Thank you for joining us. A huge thank you to my panel. I've really enjoyed the conversation today. We'll be back in March, and we'll be reflecting on the measures announced in the budget and digging into particularly what they mean for you as business leaders. We'll be asking what business leaders need to be thinking about for the rest of this year, a year when half of the world's population will be heading to the polls. So I hope you'll be able to join us, and we'll see you then.